We like to categorize things, put them in neat little boxes with defined walls and simple labels, and expect that nothing will ever change or break free of those molds. We do this with people, with media and clothing. We even do it with tools. We assign something, anything, a function, and we rarely think about the ways in which it might work outside of those parameters. Take the computer, for example. We have expectations for our computers. We want them to be good at math and processing data. We want them to assist in our daily tasks, to look things up when we don't know the answer, to store our documents and photos. What we don't expect our computers to do is help us to understand what it might feel like to die, or assist us in evoking an emotional response through heart-wrenching musicality. These, in our categorized belief system, are human endeavors, distinctly separate from science and innovation. Yet, computers can do these things, and they are, all of the time. Dr. Nicholas Laudadio has been examining this relationship between technology, music, humanity, and art for the better part of the last 20 years. His research has looked at the many ways in which electronic music, especially analog synthesizers, have been infused into the genre of science fiction. In studying this blurring of lines between man and machine, between musical performance and technology, a paradigm shifts in our own understanding of what it really means to be human. From Audacious Media and the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, you're listening to the Relevate podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Charles Wright. Let's begin, shall we? Dr. Laudadio, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Dan. It's nice to be out.
Your research, as I said, primarily focuses on the relationship between electronic music and science fiction. What draws you to this specific intersection of musicality, technology, and storytelling?
There's a number of answers to the question, right? There's the academic answer that comes up through the education question. There's the sort of the personal, anybody who does pop culture studies, and it's always going to have, maybe not always, but generally is going to have some sort of personal connection to the subject, right? So you'll find a lot of pop culture academics involved in fandom, right? And that line is always really interesting. For me, I sort of come at it from a slightly different angle. I was a drummer for most of my younger years, and some learned guitar and piano and all that sort of stuff. But I played that in my spare time. And so when it came to doing my academic research, I kind of wanted to think about something that wasn't the drums. The personal answer would be I was interested in synthesizers as I was doing my graduate work, and the graduate work I had been doing up until a certain point was a dead end. I was a big fan of science fiction when I was a kid, but I was not a big fan of science fiction in my 20s. I had kind of stopped reading it. I was actually much more of a fan of fantasy, honestly. And I felt that I kind of could write about science fiction because I wasn't emotionally invested in it. But on the other hand, it was 20th century American fiction, which I was sort of invested in terms of my academic position at the time. I was also at Buffalo, which I was coming out of a poetics program, which was so hyper-focused on poetry that I really wanted to do something non-literary because I had been doing things that had sort of been the most literary, as they like to think of themselves sometimes. And I'm still in touch with the poetry community. Love them very much. But anyways, on one hand, there's this personal idea that the 90s was a time where electronic music was seen as somehow inauthentic and part of sellout culture and every other thing you could kind of think about. Artificial, the way that people still talk about autotune and drum machines have no soul was a popular bumper sticker sold in Boston at the time just to get a sense of it. And also Boston's music scene was gnarly and mean. Sorry.
Just like Boston.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the Boston music scene, it's maybe a bit kinder now, but when I was there from 91 to 97, it was very exacting on the appropriate amount of time you needed to spend playing clubs with nobody there, what instruments you used, what amps you used, how loud you were, how loud you weren't. All of those sorts of things were part of this authenticity equation that was enforced on even the smallest of bands. So I was really fascinated by the way that all worked as I kind of got more into thinking about ideology and pop culture and such. So that's one side of it. The other side of it was the drum machines have no soul question evokes a lot of those basic theory questions, right? Can we really get any contact with something that's real, true, human? And music is much like the way they talk about poetry in a lot of our criticism, right? Music is always sort of on that line between things we can kind of rationally process and things we just, you just have to feel, right? And I think by the same token, the kind of line that divides where the sort of human ends and where the machine begins is, one of those things you just have to feel. And when it comes to whether or not music is authentic or fake, it's one of those things you just have to feel. And so there's a lot of feeling going on, more than it. Possibly that's a Boston joke more than a feeling. See, sorry, I didn't want to let that one go. Wanted to wrap around to the Boston thing again. But anyways, all these things sort of converge in a question, which is, what's the degree to which sort of a certain kind of sound produced by a certain kind of instrument can have like sort of semiotic heft in a conversation that's pretty far away from understanding what any of that means.
Yeah. So what do you think that the synthesizer specifically does for science fiction that, say, regular instrumentation doesn't?
It connects with art. I mean, so many of the machines you find in what Darko Suvin called the novum, right? The new things. What are the instruments in science fiction that bring us outside of our particular kind of experience of the world? And space guns and the ships and everything in Star Wars and all that kind of thing, right? The technology that's like magic. The example I often like to use in my class is in The Fifth Element when Bruce Willis has a cigarette. It's instead of being like what actually happened where people vape, they decided, well, why don't we make the cigarette 75% filter? And so it's like an old cigarette where all of it's filter and there's just a little tobacco at the end. And the extrapolation there, right, is that in the future, people are going to acknowledge that cigarettes are bad and that the filter is the solution. Of course, we know now that that was all like a ruse and that was just as bad for you as anything else. But that idea of using this one object to kind of contain all these anxieties and all of these sort of liminal conversations, I think there aren't a lot of what we think of maybe as aesthetic science fiction texts that worry about extrapolation in art. And so to think about art and machinery together is something that's already a subgenre of science fiction, but then to add the music question onto it, you find yourself with a small but kind of notable handful of texts that don't just use music to make science fictional environments, but actually try to incorporate it into the diegesis, make it part of the story. Yeah, so, 2001 is one of those examples where people like to think of it as like, it's almost a musical. I mean, it is a musical, with big dancing machines and whatnot. But the only musical instrument in the story is Hal, because he sings, right? Yeah. That's how he dies.
Well, yeah, so that's the ironic thing of 2001 is that the most human character is the robot.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. And a lot of that kind of humanity comes from the moment where he sings. There are also... I'm really fascinated by mid-century music trends, not the ones that we tend to celebrate, the rock and rolls and all that, but like the real ones, the ones that actually made money, like mood music and Muzak and 100,001 Strings, that sort of thing. And there's a lot of, not a lot, but I think probably the most notable author would be Philip K. Dick. You probably noticed I published on this, but the idea of he created an object called the mood organ, which was basically a version of the popular in-home console organs that lots of people had in their houses back then, middle-class Americans especially. And so the idea that one hand, put it on samba, turn it up to happiness and push the button and everybody would dance as they drank their cocktails at noon. There's a Twilight Zone episode about this, but uses a player piano. But the idea that like something happens when you automate music. You can't really automate painting in the same way. I mean, you can. My colleague, Dr. Boren, made a Jackson Pollock machine that sprayed paint everywhere. It was pretty cool. But generally, it's certainly in the age of AI, this is a different conversation. But the 20th century, something about threatening music or bringing music into this conversation where humanity is under threat, which is most science fiction, adds a completely different dimension. And I kind of just got into exploring it.
Yeah, that's a great segue to my next question, which is, you've been looking into this now for, 2 decades, basically. How has your research changed, focused, or shifted over the last 20 years?
Right. Sort of jokingly, I've been literally writing a book since 1997, and I don't really want to finish it at this point because, honestly, I don't know what AI's done yet. And what I've been doing recently is actually going further back. I just gave a talk last year at a conference about things like Gargantua and Pantagruel and really early work that tries to conceptualize how sound functions before they really knew. I kind of try to chase down all the times I can in sort of lit and pop culture up until where we kind of extrapolate about how sound works using popular narrative, right? Because sound's pretty confusing. It's hard to explain to people how sound works. You and I know how to use most of these knobs and cables and know what MIDI in is and MIDI out and MIDI through, but I think it's very, very occult for a lot of people, right? Sound bends around corners. It doesn't make sense in a lot of the ways we frame our sort of experience. So anyways, I think sound and music are already pretty abstract and magical to begin with. So when you drop them down in the middle of a narrative that's grounded in kind of a rational exploration of extrapolative futures, then it complicates things pretty dramatically.
Yeah. I'm very fascinated by sound and sound as text, and that sort of how very different it is from language and how it is almost its own language. Tell me about your project that you're working on right now, The Sound of Plants Dying.
And living. It's sort of a long way there, but in short, that project, what I've been doing is, and you probably know this, Dan, I mean, when you spend a lot of time kind of with electronic, not just electronic music, like, craft work or something, but just the whole process of dealing with sound in some sort of structural way. Like you're manipulating it, you're editing it, you're recording it, you're just kind of trying to capture it, contain it, and make it available, right? Sort of what you're doing right now. I think one of the things that we tend to, because everything I do is about the authenticity question. That's like the top question for me. I was so taken aback by the sharp divide that existed between musical subcultures around this question, that people felt legitimate animosity towards each other over whether or not they thought the other person had done their time, whether or not they were making the right kind of music with the right kind of thing. Exactly, we already talked about that. So one of the things that I think that you get from the mid-century avant-garde tradition is a lot of people pushing the boundaries of where do you locate composition. John Cage does a lot of that. You get that in the musique concrète stuff. You get that in, didn't his 600-year-long music piece just change chords yesterday? I think it did. The idea that what happens when you remove ego, you remove composition, you get the kind of singer-songwriter myth out of your way a little bit, which is a lovely thing to do. And think about how we organize sound without necessarily hanging all of our hats on authorial intention, right? So one of the ideas that I've been interested in biomusic for a long time, ever since I first discovered Song of the Humpback Whale, which is a landmark album in American ambient music. I love the idea of making music that isn't me. I've always really enjoyed being a producer and engineer and working with sound, and occasionally I'll come up with ways to do singer-songwritery things to accomplish specific goals. But I don't like that. I've never liked that very much. I have to do it pretty varied. And so for me, the plant thing is really fun because on one hand, there's a lot of problems to solve. Like, how do you use a leaf to make music? Which is a wonderful problem to begin your day with. And then sort of how do you make it interesting and listenable? And, I'm not making pop music here, but I think...
Not yet.
You'll have to ask the plants. But so the idea began with 3 short recordings of 3 songs each. Songs, tunes, whatever. The first 3 is music from Dying Leaves. The second is music from Living Leaves, indoor, and the third one is music from Living Leaves, outdoor, where basically, leaves are full of water. They let light through. Those are 2 parameters that can be used to adjust a parameter in sound, how loud a sound is, if you want to sweep a filter across a frequency spectrum, if you want to play with delays, like how many times does a sound repeat? If you want to play with MIDI data, does it create a pitch? Does it create how long a note holds and releases? And so there's a thing called Plant Wave, which is really this fun little device that this person sells online, which is for meditation, which harnesses plants. But really all it does is it kind of uses a really very basic algorithm. It makes sound anyways. It's whether or not the plant works isn't going to do much. Most importantly, it does MIDI out. And so for those who don't know that, basically it creates data through the plant and it doesn't use that data to make sound. It just gives you the data so you can make your own. And so I found out a way through just messing with this stupid thing. And then I came up with another way to do it, using opacity, light through a leaf, and then doing conductivity, passing electricity through a leaf, more water, less water, that kind of thing. Leaf underwater, leaf not underwater, leaf pulled off of the plant, leaf not pulled off of the plant. And it basically just a bunch of fun experiments trying to see how much sound, pleasant sound, I like pleasant sounds, I could generate using neighborhood stuff. And in this case, it was just a plant. And it's not a big idea that comes, it's a lot of experimental composers have done stuff like this. But yeah, anyway, so, and the other thing quickly is I use only ones in my yard. Try to pick the ones that are from here too, to the best of my knowledge.
You got to support local.
I'm not a big plant person, but I try to do native plants.
Yeah. This project is really interesting to me, and I don't think projects like this get enough attention in the wider media. The technology that you're using effectively synthesizes the biological changes of a living organism as it undergoes the process of death or life, and it turns it into language, but not just any language, the language of music. It's literally the sound of something ceasing to be, a tangible reading of the mysterious transformation that all throughout human history we've only been able to ascribe to religious beliefs or superstitions. And we, as humans, have no way of comprehending this information. We have no language or biological sensors for it. But this computer program does. It reads the information and it transforms it into something else. And then we can listen to that transfer of energy as sound waves. It's incredible. And
it's trying to find authenticity in electronic music and electronic sounds because, one of the ways I think about it too, when I'm sitting there kind of wired up in the studio and trying to get all of this to work, it takes a long time to get everything to work just the way you want it to, not because the plants are resisting you, because the technology is. But what it does is it also draws attention to one of the ways that a lot of people who study musical instruments as sort of cultural and social phenomenon, which is, I sort of see myself kind of I love the term an organologist. Specifically a cultural organologist is a term I've used sort of jokingly in the past, but as I get older, I kind of like it more and more. One of the things that you're doing, like the instrument is a site of resistance. You have all of these musical ideas in your head, and you totally know how to use Pro Tools and all of these kind of analog digital converters, and you know how to use a compressor and all of that kind of stuff. But like we tell our students, you don't know what you think until you write it down. Getting it out of your head is just really hard. And when you're in a position such as myself, who you sort of see yourself as someone who works with music in terms of creation and production, and you also study it, sometimes you can really bind yourself up, overthinking it. So in this case, I was thinking this is a great way to kind of get around some of that. But I was remembering, this is a short aside, and there is a point to it. When I was in graduate school, there was a thing called the SETI, S-E-T-I, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, had a screensaver. And it was basically an early version of distributed processing where everybody who downloaded the screensaver was helping process the information that these scientists were pulling from outer space in their search for extraterrestrial intelligence. You should read about it. It was a fascinating moment. I think it still exists. It's legit, but also a little mystical.
But I think that research should be.
Absolutely.
We arrived at a lot of really amazing discoveries in the Renaissance because people were trying to figure out what magic was. And it turned out it was just chemistry and biology.
No, right. And the thing about the SETI stuff, right, is it's this beautiful data. So it was a really nice screensaver because whoever did the data visualization stuff really kind of, they're important, I would say, in that world, I'm sure. I hope they are. But it was neat to see just data parsed on your screen while you're sitting there doing other things. But the idea was that they had these algorithms that could find some pattern in the data should it appear. The thing is, when you hook up a couple of like the kind when you go get your heart monitored, I have a bunch of those, and what you do is you'll take
an EKG kind of
but the sticky pads.
Mm-hmm.
You'll take like a leaf, like say like a southern magnolia leaf, something big, and you'll stick one on one side and one on the other, and you'll run a basic small current through there and measure the intensities as they go through time. So it'll be just like if it's like a 0 to 5 volts, say you're using like really analog. Sometimes I'll use an analog modular synthesizer. Sometimes I'll use just MIDI digital stuff. You'll get like, oh, that's just MIDI noise, like that's not changing, it'll just be like me, whatever. But then all of a sudden you'll get things set up just right, and all of a sudden you'll get randomness. And it's just like all of a sudden for this little moment, you're like, oh, this plant is kind of talking, you know, it's sort of making a sound. And that kind of appearance of randomness in the data, I sometimes will do like a little on a data capture program. There's a MIDI program that'll just sort of capture it on its way. And so you can see just in like a chart, you know, oh, it's hitting C4, it's the velocity, how hard it hits is like 100, the pitch is, you know, or how long it holds is there, the sustained decay, all that kind of things. You can just see all these parameters that normally would be a person hitting a piano key or whatever, twisting a knob on a synth. But all it is you throwing like a steady current through a variable sort of resistor and getting a pattern out the other end. And the idea is if you stack those patterns, you get polyrhythms, you get melodies, you get harmonies, you get dissonances. And plus a lot of them I was using a pretty heavy digital sound sources because I wanted to have a lot of control over the waveforms too. Because the idea is eventually is to create a whole bank of input and output points that can use opacity and conductivity and a few other parameters I'm kind of playing around with to create a slightly larger piece. It'd be nice to have a whole tree.
Sure. Oh, yeah. Sure.
We have about 100-foot tall pecan tree in our backyard full of squirrels. That is I'm just struggling to figure out how to find its voice, you know.
You need to move it into the studio where they record the BBC Symphony Orchestra and get all of the inputs, because you need a big mixing board for that.
They took all the trees and put them in a tree museum.
That's science fiction right there.
Yeah, you know, one of the fun things too is if anybody in the South, you know, the pecan trees really tend to dump all their leaves at once, and on a particularly windy day, you'll see them all start coming down. And so one of the ideas I had for the thing I'm working on right now is doing video capture of leaf fall and 90-degreeing it and putting it on a scale, on a staff.
Oh, yeah.
And so you have intermittence and you have where they fall turned sideways like that. And so the idea would be, this is a whole other project of trying to get some people to do some slightly more tech with me. I'm trying to find some people who are a little more invested in the programming side of it. But so the idea would be, it's certainly, I posted it just kind of demo-y. It was never seen as a final project. It was more of a proof of concept. But it's gotten a little more legs than that, and it's been sort of fun to kind of chase it down because it's a pretty simple idea, but it has actually a lot of potential, I think, to make a lot of weird things, good things.
You have a chapter in the Routledge Companion to Cyberpunk, which was published in 2019, which I thought was a very cool article. In it, you discuss the innate relationship between the cyberpunk genre and its fundamental musicality, because the genre itself is literally cyberpunk. Like, the music is built into the very title of the genre. Now, the genre was at its most popular in sort of the late 80s and early 90s, and then it sort of fizzled out. But in the last 5 years or so, I've noticed that cyberpunk has really come back in a big way. There's films like Blade Runner 2049, technically cyberpunk. The fourth Matrix movie, The Matrix, came back. Then Netflix's Altered Carbon series is a cyberpunk sort of TV show that's really popular. And then there was that huge hype around the Cyberpunk 2077 video game that came out. And although that flopped and people hated it when it actually came out, the people were really excited.
It's rallied, though. People are really into it again.
Yeah, because they fixed it. They released it too early.
Yeah, it's always that story. Always that story.
But so I was wondering, someone who has studied this in a scholarly way, what do you think is stirring up this return to the cyberpunk storytelling style?
Yeah, there's the really obvious answer is, you know, we used to call it the retro clock. I was in grad school in the late 90s to early 2000s. And so when I would go to a thrift store or something, there would be stuff from the 70s. 60s and 70s was kind of popular if you wanted to dress in old clothes, right? As you get into, I remember I started teaching at UNCW in 2003. That's the era of, you know, trucker hats and Paris Hilton and stuff. But there was a lot of 80s stuff was in, and 80s dance parties and things. And so there's this idea that we have this retro clock where we're dragging our understanding of the past along with us, and it takes a certain amount of time to process it and redeploy it and all that. In the age of constant internet stuff, right, that whole thing has changed, and everything's kind of everything Always, All at Once. What's the name of that movie? Yeah.
Yeah, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once.
That. And so I think on one hand, it's the simple thing. It's like people finally discovered it and it's entering into the mishmash, right? And it just so happens to be thematically related to the mishmash. So when William Gibson is sitting down in 1981 or whenever he writes Neuromancer, or even going back when Philip K. Dick is doing his thing in the late 60s, mid 60s, there's a sense that, we're dumping all of our money into NASA and we're thinking about robots. And like Cyberpunk makes a lot of sense just from the perspective of the way that technology is going. Add to it the steampunk stuff that happened a while back, right? I think it's just, it rides on a similar kind of rise of the con fandom. We can all get together and talk about text. There's popular ones, there's obscure ones, there's a video game, we can RPG it. Like, it's like a good category. I really enjoy, I don't play much, but I really enjoy early Dungeons and Dragons stuff for the art. Early fantasy art from that era is great because it's hyper amateur. But if you look at early D&D stuff, a lot of it will be your dungeon crawls and your usual kind of Tolkien-ish thing. But there's a lot of science fiction in it too. And there's this kind of, that cyber robo 2010 was really 70s. It's really like we've been kind of into that.
Makes me think of Warhammer too, because Warhammer has I don't know if you're familiar with
Warhammer. Very much
yeah.
so. Yeah. Right. And I think the cyberpunk thing, from the perspective of why is it back? I mean, because it's about where we are. Yeah. And because it's got that retro chic and it looks kind of cool. And honestly, Neuromancer is still sort of good. I mean, we all want to be like cool online. And that's just like the first cool online story. Now, on the music side of it, I was very into the Chicago industrial scene when I was in high school, specifically. Well, Chicago via Wax Trax Records, but there are bands from Germany and Austria and all that. Bands like Front 242, Frontline Assembly, things that would become Nine Inch Nails and that. Like the people who came sort of before that. A lot of that was sort of cyberpunk in nature. There's a really famous Front 242 song where it's about an assassin. We're looking for this man to sell him to other man. And, it has that great sort of English as a second language pop vibe, but it's super dark and they're all like shaved head Belgians or Austrians. And it has this whole sort of computers are cool vibe, I'm stealing things, I'm hacking the internets with my defenses and war games and, that kind of 80s, early 90s kind of thought we could all still do it thing. Yeah, so anyways, cyberpunk as a musical genre too, it makes a lot of sense because the machines sort of we're using to visualize hacking are a lot of times just synthesizer gear.
I think it speaks to the different times cultural anxieties too, because a lot of times the stories that we tell are to deal with our own things that we're worried about. Absolutely. And in that time when cyberpunk first came up, the computer was basically just taking a center stage in the way that the world worked. Computers were really taking over in the way that society was functioning, and so you have a lot of anxiety with that too, with that sort of change. And then we got used to it, and the genre sort of went away because they're like, oh no, we're not all going to get sucked into our computers, and they're not going to take over like the Terminator. I think that we're okay. And then now with the birth of social media, and that which sure spawns online communities and stuff, but it also I think sort of speaks to that whole cultural anxiety around an online culture and life, and so cyberpunk can come right back from that because it's like, we're getting a little too deep into tech here.
Right. Well, and the thing about the cyberpunk stuff is you can die online. Yeah. That's a part of those narratives. One of the extrapolative components of a lot of them is there's always like somebody has the plug pulled on them or something like that. And I think there's the stakes are pretty high in cyberpunk when it comes to tech. And I think you're right, in an age of where we are, something from the past that carries with it a kind of a prophetic sense of the stakes is pretty cool.
Yeah. Why do you believe that your research into science fiction and your analysis of that specific genre is essential?
Well, the practical answer is when you're in grad school, you have to periodize. You have to write about something that people aren't writing about. And I found myself, as I moved away from contemporary poetry and poetics, thinking about my interest in music and my interest in fantastic narrative. It just seemed to me that nobody was talking about the times where science fiction was trying to predict the future of art. and specifically music. And so I found a few examples along the way of that and started writing about it. And it became my dissertation. And it has, like you said, been sort of the only thing I've worked on. Now, to say it's essential, no, but I think it's like, I don't think people do my kind of work to do essential work. What we're doing is we're just trying to make sure that all of the loose ends are covered when it comes to saying, here's one of the stories of how humanity adapted to its machines. And one of the things we had to adapt to is outsourcing certain aspects of our creative production to those machines, something that people are feeling a great deal of anxiety about right now.
Yeah, I would agree. And also to make you feel better about your own field, I think that something that validates a piece of art is the necessity to criticize it and talk about it. And so you are validating science fiction as a worthwhile genre in your work. So I would argue that your work is essential for the millions of science fiction fans out there, because you help validate the need of science fiction, or the need for science fiction, and establishing it as an art form.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you. And if there are millions of people out there interested, I'm disappointed in the lack of distribution networks that academic publishing has come up with, because it seems to me there's just 9 very nice people in Germany and Switzerland who like to read my stuff. But yeah, no, I think you're right to the extent that, even absent the sort of the fandom side of it, I think, how much money does science fiction make?
Look at Marvel, Star Wars, all of the biggest IPs are science fiction.
But they wouldn't be called science fiction. So if you see, the thing is, if I sit down and I have to do this occasionally and explain that I do study science fiction, people will often be like, oh, I don't read science fiction. But yet they will have seen every Marvel film. And so, so I think part of it is getting away from the science fiction part of it too, and you'll use language like extrapolative narrative and the fantastic and all that. But yeah, no, I think so much of electronic music is at its heart extrapolative anyways, right? Because, even if you pull out a synthesizer from 1983 and do a little bit of twiddling on it, you can make it sort of signify futurity for even the most unconcerned listener, because it's just hardwired, to use that metaphor. But yeah, and I also think that the science fiction side of it's important too, because whether you like science fiction or not, look at the setup we have here is very casual. And yet the tripod alone would have been the source of a news story in 1986, right? Certainly based on H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds Walkers, Actually, you can really visualize that pretty easily. And so I think we're living in the world that science fiction built anyways. So might as well take a bit of a critical view at the way they're not building machines to do the hard work for us. They're building machines to write poetry and make music. There has to be a reason, and that's something people are worried about. And I think if we look at the history of science fiction, meditating on these subjects, you'll find a lot of ways to think about it. And that's kind of where my work comes from, if you want to think about it in any practical fashion. What
inspired you to pursue a degree in the humanities in the first place? Let's take it all the way back.
There were different times. I was always one of those people who tested evenly sciences, and I liked math. I liked doing math. I had a really good calculus teacher when I was in high school, but I did not have a particularly academically advanced high school experience. I went to Catholic school in South Texas, and South Texas is pretty far off the map, certainly was back then. And so my mom was a teacher. My dad did construction stuff. And so I was a reader. I did all that kind of thing, like a lot of us, Tolkien and science fiction and reading, just to kind of get yourself through junior high and high school. And when I got to college, I went to Boston University. There was a sense that I was going to be very practical and get an advertising degree. And I really enjoyed actually doing advertising, but I also realized quickly what that job was and decided to do a double major in humanities, English literature, because Boston University had a pretty austere, cool kind of, if you're into old school stuff, program at the time. So I didn't actually plan on going into academia. I just wanted to see if I could get a double major done, and I did. And then I wanted to see if I could get an honors thesis done, and I did. And then I wanted to go to graduate school, and I did. And then I was a right time, right place sort of person. But for me, the humanities just have always seemed the obvious thing that if I could do that, I would. And I was lucky enough to be able to.
How has your job as a professor changed over the last 20 years?
I think one colleague of mine put it recently that when we started this job, we just made photocopies and handed them out. And though that was said in jest, I think there is a certain truth to the dramatic change that we have experienced in the humanities. We're in a library with a podcast maker space. And, it's the way that information is processed and distributed has obviously changed. So yeah, there's all that obvious stuff. There's a great deal of animosity towards the humanities that's always kind of been a part of, there's a Pulitzer Prize winning book from the 60s called Anti-Intellectualism in America, right? This is nothing new. But the procedures through which state governments have been kind of dealing with fields and departments and people that they find problematic has changed. So UNCG story, right? Departments canceled. If you can't get rid of tenure, you can get rid of the department. It's a little bit easier. I think in Indiana, they're trying to legislate away tenure. I am fortunate enough to be in an English department that is full of a number of very active and engaged people, both in terms of service, teaching, and research. And so I feel that I've got very good people working with me. But I think the ground we stand on is a lot more tenuous than it was when I got here in 2003. And there was this sort of, there were simple things like the state would give a teacher a raise if they got a degree from a UNC system at the graduate level. And then about 10 years ago, maybe, they got rid of that. And as you would imagine, we have a lot fewer people in the graduate program looking just as teachers, right, to expand their pedagogy. And, that's a shame, but that's by design, And I think a lot of fields are feeling the cut, like saying you don't have enough majors. And you're saying, well, you don't advertise us and you tell everyone that we're not worthy. And, we don't go through that, but a lot of departments do. So I think on the bad side, things have gotten a lot dodgier. You were a little less comfortable in feeling insulated from that stuff. One other strange way that it's changed is when I started teaching, I could always expect that students would know how to do the tech stuff. Now they don't, because we've so absorbed everything. Like a lot of students grow up on touchscreens, and so keyboards and mice are weird, right? It's like the cursive thing. Yeah. And so I think what I can expect, like this sense of consistent progress and technological adeptness that I thought I could expect from students changed, which was really revealing and interesting, like a good way. I don't see that as a bad thing. It's just what it is. And as far as the material is concerned, I don't feel that any of it's changed. I mean, I taught John Donne and Herbert yesterday. I feel in some ways the material is the material. That's one thing I love about it. It's like the theory class. You can't wear that stuff out. I think institutional support, I think how much we're expected to do, I think how much we get paid, I think all of that stuff is certainly a conversation. But when it comes to what we're talking about here, students are as good as ever, better if not. The material is as available as it's ever been. We are more in charge of our own stuff, seeing as we don't quite have the support that we once did from the institutions who are obviously fighting their own fight. So I absolutely love what I do, but I think the challenges are definitely there. And from the looks of it, they're going to stay. Yes. I'm optimistic, but skeptical.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a perfect lead into my next question. So we're surrounded by what seems to be all this doom and gloom. Again, the media and all these New York Times articles talking. It seems like every year we get a new New York Times or New Yorker article saying that the humanities are dying. And I'm like, guys, please stop saying that. You're going to make it true. What gives you hope in the humanities?
Well, as we were all, this is a point that's been made a bunch, but as we were all holed up during the pandemic, everybody was entertained by artists, right? We all listened to music. Even if it was celebrities singing Imagine from their Venetian balconies. I still haven't gotten over that. It's like, U2 forcing their album into your iPod. It's just something that we can never really get over, us serious music consumers. But the easy answer is my students. I'm teaching a religion and spirituality class right now. I'm teaching undergraduate theory, and these classes both get into heavy stuff real quick. And I'm not worried about whether or not the humanities is going to be relevant to my students. And a lot of my students this semester are not English majors or not humanities majors because I'm teaching a 190. And I think it's really, our job in the humanities, obviously, to make this sales pitch. But I think all things being equal across the disciplines, there would be no concern about the humanities if we were funded and advertised appropriately. But the problem is capitalism is built up around business schools. And business schools and science done for major corporations, no judgment, is just going to make a tremendous amount of money, something that people who study electronic music and science fiction from a cultural perspective are not going to be able to do. And that's fine. That wouldn't make any sense. But the notion that the university needs to mirror the logic of cutthroat capitalism is maybe something that we might want to consider, because the humanities wouldn't be in crisis if we just acknowledge that not all importance is reflected through financial success. But this is such an obvious point as to be kind of trite. You know what I mean? But I remain optimistic to the extent that we're still here and we're hiring, and my classes are generally full, and, people are still subscribing to Netflix and Paramount Plus and Disney Plus, and there's 19 different Mandalorian spinoffs, and, the conversation goes on. I think science fiction is really good right now. I made a promise to a friend that I would watch all of the Star Wars stuff. I have a friend who's a very, very, very big Star Wars fan, and I'm a science fiction scholar, and they're fine. They're great. Sure, whatever. I don't have any particular beyond that, or Star Trek or any of that kind of stuff. Blade Runner universe is fun. I'm really if I had to be a fan of anything, I love the bad Alien movies.
Oh, sure.
Prometheus, yeah. Covenant.
Oh, Ridley Scott.
Yeah, they're terrible. I love them. Do you?
I do. No, I do. Actually, I those hold a special place in my heart, because with every single one except for Alien and Aliens, the second one, I think that they started with a great idea and just failed miserably at pulling it off. Right. Every single time.
I would say if you got rid of all of the horror elements of Prometheus and leaned in on the lore.
Yeah, because it should have been. It's
good.
That's like the Alien universe's Silmarillion. That's what they're going for. But again,
they blew it.
Missed the mark.
But I still love watching it. No,
it's so beautiful. Those movies are, especially the new ones, they're so beautiful.
Yeah, a friend of mine and I watched it on Christmas Eve together. It was wonderful. It's very festive. But I just think that science fiction is really good and is relevant and is making more money than ever, and it's all over the place. And I also do horror stuff, and so half of another very musical genre, right? Yeah. The difference between a drama and a horror film is really just the score. And I think there's so much money and talent in all of that, because even though we sort of dealing with genre from the study of literature has always been kind of difficult, because it's not better than that, but it's still really good. Philip K. Dick is great, but he's no Melville, but does that matter, right? And all of that stuff, there's a sense that the popular voice surrounding extrapolative stuff is really responding to cool things. They remade Suspiria, it's there's an audience. So back to the optimism question, I just think that all of the stuff is still there. There's still literary publishing, and there's still outlets for all of that. And if anything, the audience is broader than ever. The problem is as with Spotify and all these things, is we lost control of the revenue stream as if we ever had it. So I think it will be interesting to see what the Gen Zs and all of them do with the apparatus left over by the 20th century's attempts to kind of find a balance between authentic human sort of experience and all of this technological mediation we've adopted. And I think the humanities crisis comes from misunderstanding that connection. So maybe in some tiny, tiny way, looking at the stuff that I look at as an attempt to sort of rebalance that out a little bit.
Yeah, nice. As someone who studies music and science fiction and the intersection between those two things, I have to ask, what is your scholarly opinion on the theremin?
The theremin is a gateway drug. For me, I got into, my first synth was like a Casio SK5, but I remember encountering the theremin. A lot of people did in that Led Zeppelin thing, but for me, it was watching I had to watch a lot of daytime TV when I was growing up, and I remember a lot of those, just the mid-century science fiction films, again, Bernard Herrmann score for The Day the Earth Stood Still in 1951 with the theremin score Dr. Samuel Hoffman, I think, the sound of the ship coming in over the Washington Mall. And I just remembered that. And it's a really common thing. And also I loved Forbidden Planet, which I also wrote about. But the theremin is one of these instruments that's super funny because it was invented to be easy to play and it's very impossible to play.
It is, yes.
Right? Moog Music in Nashville, may they rest in peace, figured it out they have an instrument called the theremin. Or what they did was they embedded a quantizer algorithm in it. So for people who don't know, a quantizer basically is an algorithm that will catch a note that's flat or sharp and just nudge it into the scale. So if you hit A sharp, B sharp, C sharp, D sharp, is there a B sharp? Well, ask The Simpsons, right? If you hit those and you don't want them to be sharp, you want them to be natural or whatever, then what a quantizer will just sort of based on parameters of how much you want it to do it and what scale you want it to go to, it will literally adjust it for you. In fact, the next thing with the plant music is using a quantizer, but not, I kind of like the swoopiness of it, pitch shifting all over the place. But anyways, the theremin without a quantizer, without like being able to lock it to a pitch that makes sense, is for most people a sound effects generator. And so I think, critically speaking, I think it's the perfect electronic instrument because it's supposed to be easy. It isn't. It can be musical, but it's hard. It's a really simple technology, but very few people have figured out how to use it.
It's also very physical. Like you are using your body to play. You're not programming. I mean, there's some knobs and whatever, but you're not programming anything. Like you are using your hands and your arms and your body to make that thing make noise. So I think that it represents such a great, it's a cyborg experience. Absolutely.
And yeah, actually when I was talking about the tree music thing before, one of the things that theremins do, right, is one antenna adjusts pitch and one antenna adjusts loudness, we'll say, velocity to whatever. And as you get closer, right, more of your hand is closer to the antenna, so therefore there's more electricity can pass. Anyways, using that with plants is fun because it's basically like a proximity sensor. And so the problem is if you just wave your hand in front of it, you get the woo, woo, woo sound. But if you put, like I said, a quantizer, like quantitizer, it'll do dun, 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 dun. Instead of going, whoa, like a full portamento up a scale, it'll step it. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, if you use that technology from the theremin, which, like you said, it's very physical, you're like they used to say it's like conducting an ethereal orchestra. You're waving your hands around in space and there's no frets to mark anything. You have to. So if you watch someone like Clara Rockmore, who really knows how to play it, you'll see them using their knuckles because they'll have to memorize, because it's really hard to know where you are in space precise enough. So that's why she would put a speaker behind her head so she could adjust the pitch quickly before it got to the audience. So the theremin is a virtuoso instrument, and it's also a woo, woo, woo kind of let's make a science fiction movie instrument. So I think it's perfect. I write about it. I think about it a lot. I have a couple of them because they are just sort of like, you don't sit down and play Wonderwall on it.
Yeah. They can get a bad rap because people think they're gimmicky, but
because they can be.
Right, and they can be, but then I was like, watch a person who knows how to play the theremin, watch them do it, and you're
Absolutely.
Like, oh wow, that's amazing.
Right, because it is, when it is done well, especially if you hear the early recordings, it sounds like a hybrid of a human voice, a violin, and an electronic oscillator. And those three elements are exactly the elements that are sort of abstractly in play as the mid-century is moving into the kind of full technological manifestation of musical consumption and production. So like, every step, no matter how natural your music is, every step of it along the way enters the digital sphere, is compressed, is limited, is EQ'd, is all of that. And you sit it down, you're like, oh, this is such a beautiful banjo record, right? I can hear the banjo and I can hear the stool creak or whatever. You're like, well, yeah, that's because we compressed that stool creak sound, so it will bring it up a little bit. We also EQ'd it so you could hear it over the banjo. The idea that all of that technological intervention and mediation is somehow transparent and not getting in the way of the humanity is just such a silly thing. And so for me, I feel like in the end, we are all sort of necessitating that people consider that every last thing has a history to it, right? And everything that has a history has a set of expectations and political demands and all that kind of thing. And so in this case, there has to be some reason why we keep insisting that music in the age of technological reproduction must be the most authentic thing we do. And yet we all listen to it through our terrible, terrible iPhone speakers. Yeah. Right? And so, you know, that contradiction, I think, is the thing that keeps me coming back to the same topic over and over and over again.
I ask the same last question to all of our guests. I really appreciate you coming on. This was great. What is the best book that you've read recently?
You know, I have a few answers to that, but I would say the best book that I reread recently was a book called Love Saves the Day, A History of Dance Music in America, 1970s to 1980 something. And, you know, I think one of the things I like about the things I study is I study transitional moments. I'm really in 1947 to 83 is the really time I really like, but say 47 to 97. A lot of things changed pretty dramatically in that time in terms of reproduction and sound and all that. And the rise of dance culture and DJ culture and the intervention that was AIDS and the decimation of those communities and the rebuilding of everything after that into the rave scene and all that kind of stuff. Like, that history is such an important part of where we are right now in America. And it's, I think, a rather understudied one when it comes to at least my world and my students and the people I talk to. So for me, I would say the book I would put out there would be any one of the books like that. There's one called Turn the Beat Around, which is also really good. And then there's How to Wreck a Nice Speech, which is a history of the vocoder. So how to recognize speech, how to wreck a nice speech. Because when you're using a vocoder, right, which is like a theremin technology where you're basically combining the shape of a voice sound with an electronic oscillator, you sometimes have to say different things in order to sound like something else. So to recognize speech may get all muddled, but how to wreck a nice beach, you'll understand it better on the other end. So those books all kind of make technological things that are very open and human and dancing with our friends at night with the lights on, where we all feel very kind of at our most basic, wonderful selves, but yet there's so many wires involved. And I'm fascinated by the wires and the way that we kind of try to program people's moods through things that they don't think about. So yeah, the history of dance music in America, it's a good thing.
Dr. Laudadio, thank you for coming on the show.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Dan. I really appreciate it. That was fun.
Relevate is produced each week by Audacious Media and the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Today's episode was hosted, produced, and edited by myself, Daniel Charles Wright, and executive produced by Dr. Megan Sweeney. The music that you're listening to right now, and the music that we opened our show with, is from Music from Living Leaves, Music from Dying Leaves, Dr. Laudadio's Biomusical Experiments. You can find more of it at laudadio.bandcamp.com. If you have a project, a paper, or a topic that you'd like to discuss on the podcast, and you're a faculty member or a student of an accredited college or university, please send us an email at relevatepod@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.